So, Doug, it's a great honor to have you here because, short explanation to our audience, you are the one of the very few male SRA satanic ritual abuse survivors who are speaking out, also survivor of super soldier programming, Mclntyre programming, and many, many more. So it's big pleasure and honor, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Olga. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So would you like maybe to share your story a little bit from the beginning, the family you were born, so our audience have an understanding of your background?
Yes, I was born in Sydney, Australia in the early 1960s. My childhood was very brutal and full of neglect. So my parents basically, abandoned me at home, if I can put it that way. So I was in a house environment, but I was purposely given no affection, no attention, and was treated brutally. I was also subject to a lot of experimentation.
Okay, maybe later on a little bit on experimentation we will proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, that was part of Ultra. So Martin Orne from the CIA came to Sydney University, and the CIA was very involved in Sydney during the 50s and 60s and 70s and so on. And the hospital where I was born at was associated with Sydney University. So from a very young age, I was involved in cult activities and Ultra CIA activities.
Thank you, Doug. A little bit more detail, what are the cult activities in your case? Because this information is coming out first time for Russian audience, so people may not be familiar with that.
Okay. Well, the main cult activities, and my memories are still not complete. I have memories of various things that are all consistent, but I still have gaps in my memories. But my earliest cult memory is at the age of 3, and my father and his best friend, I was in a ceremony where my hand was held on a knife, while a young girl who was also 3 was sacrificed, and then I was blamed for her death.
So literally they made you a killer?
Well, I don't see that I was a killer because it wasn't consensual. I didn't want my hand on that knife.
Obviously.
It was held there. And so...
excuse me for interrupting, and for my the way I put it, I wanted to say that they made you feel that, wanted to make you feel that you are or were a killer. Yeah, you were 3 years old.
Yeah. They wanted me to feel that, and they often did things like that to me. As a young child, my father would do things sexually to me and then blame me for them. Or another time, I got buried alive in a box and my brother was blamed for it. So they would constantly do things to you and then try and make you, the hope was that you would believe them, that you were at fault. And thankfully, even from a very young age, I was able to recognize, no, I wasn't responsible for these things. That was their responsibility, not mine.
Well, thank you so much. Things you're saying, of course, for our audience is completely insane to say the least. So there is a big why. Why they're doing that?
Why they do it is, I think it's they think they get power out of it. They think it's a way that makes them powerful. Both my parents took a lot of pleasure in hurting other people because that made them feel powerful. And as a young child growing up in that environment, the reason they needed to feel that is when people do wrong things, they feel afraid. They feel afraid of consequence and repercussion. And so they need to be in positions of power to feel safe. And even though it is, horrific abuse of a little child, they have degenerated their soul to that point where, hurting other people is the only way they can feel safe. And it's an illusion. It has the opposite effect and impact, because one of the things I used to do as a child was to study my parents and my abusers' faces in order to learn, because, the only way I could feel safe was to, work with what I had. And that was one of the ways that, I learnt and protected myself, was to work out their psychology.
So basically, since the very young age, you had this strategy, if I can put it that way,
Yes.
of figuring out or sensing intuitively, maybe with the spiritual help as well, what is going on, what might happen at home, and that helped you a lot in your survival during your years at home with family.
Yeah, you have to develop survival mechanisms, otherwise you die. And they know that the survival mechanisms that you try to develop, and they use them to their advantage if they can. And for me, going out of body was a survival mechanism because my body wasn't safe. I went through repeated electrocution. I went through mind control. Very much it was in the 1960s, so it was all about learning how to mind control the masses with television. And so I would be sitting in front of this programming, these coloured images that would go over and over and over again as they tried to test things on my brain. And then for years at night when I would lie in bed, outside of the experiments, all I could still see was all those coloured boxes flashing and things like that. So, the whole purpose for them was to control, but, as a young child trying to survive, and also there being a spiritual side to it, we go out of our body and so we become very familiar with spirit. And then later on when that wasn't safe because they started drugging me, then I used my imagination and became very artistic. And that became my safe place. And, a lot of children do that. If the home environment isn't safe, I would disappear into my head for 8 hours at a time. It'd be like 2 minutes. And in that time, I would have done a masterpiece of drawing, as a little child. So it was, it's, if we don't develop those survival mechanisms, often we break, and we either die or we become like them or somewhere in between.
Thank you so much. May I ask, you mentioned experiments. How did you, or let me put it that way, who brought you there?
Well, these are the memories that are more coming back now. And we lived in a suburb called Cogra, which is a southern suburb of Sydney. And I remember they would electrocute us, it wasn't just me, again and again and again to test our limits and how far we could take the electrocution. And I would get to the point where I would throw up, and it would just be, it was horrific. Some of the children died, and they didn't care. They were, again, if we come back to the power narrative, they were so desperate to know how to, control other human beings and to have power other human beings because they knew what they were doing was wrong, but it was the only way for them to feel safe. So for a lot of them, they're petrified of death. My parents in particular.
So excuse me for interruption, these were your parents who
My parents weren't doing the electrocution. That was psychologists from Sydney University in Australia. And it was, they've written a lot of reports on that. So their focus of their studies, they had anthropologists working with them as well.
So it's very scientific. We're not speaking about something amateur or these people know what they're doing.
Oh, totally know what they're doing. So it's the CIA from the 1940s and 50s, if not earlier, we're trying to understand hypnotism. So they were going around the world to all the native tribes and looking at how that they would create what's called mesmerism, which later became called hypnotism. So they wanted to know how to control people's minds because that way they could control people. And then with the advent of television, for example, then they wanted to see how television could be used as a hypnotic mind control tool. And I was part of the experiments in the early 1960s. And the focus of the experiments I was on was they already had black and white TV, but they wanted to see...
It was a rare thing that back that day, sorry for interruption.
But for me, they wanted, or the experiments I remember being in, it was to see how we respond and react to colour. So I have a very acute colour sensitivity. So I can see, thousands of whites where some people might only see 2 or 3 whites. And so a lot of the testing on me was to see psychologically how colour influences the power to control someone. And so for me, sometimes when I look at different colours, I feel it in my body. Like I feel intense emotions sometimes are different colours. So I'm very, very sensitive to it. So, you know, I was a prime candidate for them in that sense.
Thank you so much. Well, we can start with the healing process as far as we came to the body subject. Can you please, I know in our personal or private conversations you mentioned that you were for Australian bodybuilder championship or something.
Well, that was...
You were going to the gym.
Excuse me. Yeah, I used quite a lot of modalities through my life. I never stuck with one modality. I like to explore different things, and with each modality there were tools I could learn. So, you know, as a young child I was horrifically sexually abused, particularly by my father, and he took great pleasure in that, and often when he would come into my room at night and abuse me, he would know how to trigger me so that I would disassociate and not remember the abuse. So the abuse would start, bang, I would go blank, I'd wake up the next morning and go to school as though nothing had happened. And so the early ways that I started to heal was I became co-conscious. So I would be awake in my dreams, or I could be dreaming while I was awake. And that was a part of the dissociative thing. So I remember at the age of 5, I used to have recurrent nightmares, horrific nightmares of being, you know, attacked and things like that by these monsters. And I learnt at the age of 5 how to consciously go into my dream and let the monsters get me, and then I'd just say to them, see, that doesn't hurt. And so I was able to break the fear. I was able to face my fear, and I think since the age of 5 I may have had half a dozen nightmares, if that, because of what I did at that age. It was, and you know, whether I was psychically or spiritually guided, but I was able to face the terror and walk through it, and it you know, really didn't impact me hardly at all after that. Later on, as you said, you know, in my early 20s and so on, when a lot of the memories started coming back. So I already had a lot of the memories of the physical abuse, but in my mid-20s, the sexual abuse memories started coming back. And one of the ways I started to feel powerful was to go to the gym and not just get my anger out, but to build my body up. So to know that as I looked big and strong and I trained under Mr. Australia, then I felt safer. I didn't feel completely safe because someone could have a gun or a, you know, but at least I, you know, in Australian society, that's not normal to, you know, to be attacked like that. So I could at least feel safer that way. But there were other things as well. I became, with bodybuilding, I then went and started doing modeling, and I started, you know, doing TV work, and I became very desirable. But then I realized what I was doing was I'd become unattainable from a visual point of view, and that was another way I was controlling, because as a child I had no say, particularly when I was trafficked, over what happened to my body and the things that they did to my body. And then all of a sudden as an adult, you know, now I'm this, you know, I look really good and I got an amazing body and everyone wants you, and it was like, no. But I realized that that was my trauma coming up, and that was a way I was feeling in control. And when I realized that, I didn't feel good about that. I felt that wasn't healthy, and so I stopped it. I didn't stop bodybuilding or anything like that, but I stopped, you know, becoming unattainable. And it was very lonely being unattainable, you know, because people are intimidated by you, and that wasn't something that I liked either. So, you know, you learn along the way. You know, I mean, spiritually, I've always had a very powerful spiritual path. And my guides have protected me incredibly. You know, I've been to the edge of death so many times, and I've also died and come back. So I feel incredibly protected in that sense, and that now is probably my safest place, is in the spiritual realms.
Thank you. Yesterday you mentioned a very interesting detail. I think it will be beneficial to share that.
Yeah.
That when you look at the male body, by the way, the structure of the male body,
yeah.
According to your past and your experiences, now visually you can say if there was abuse or not.
Yeah, for me, my body didn't exist from the waist down. So, you know, being an artist and things, I often would only draw myself from the waist up. But even going to the gym, it was very difficult to train my legs. You know, when I trained under Mr. Australia, he pushed me and made me do it. But it was some exercises I found the hardest, you know, because...
Below, you mean?
Yeah, below, from here down, because when I would train my legs, I would feel like crying. I'd feel like bursting into tears in the middle of the gym and running out of the gym. And so when I would train them, I would get very, very emotional. And then in recent years, I went off and did what's called sexological bodywork, where I worked with a body worker who showed me that I basically cut off my circulation probably from here down, and my sense of touch diminishes as it comes into my pelvic region where I was predominantly sexually abused. And so one of the protection mechanisms was to not feel that part of my body. But it was also not to see that part of my body, not to think about it. So because that part of my body represented pain, because you have to imagine as a young child being raped is excruciatingly painful, you know, and they do it again and again because they want that pain, they want to force that disassociation. And then when it's done by your primary caregiver, your father, the man who's meant to protect you, you know, it adds to the depth and the complexity of the pain, and they know that, and they know how to use that to not just fracture you, but to hopefully manipulate you.
Thank you. Also, you have children.
Yes.
And can you please share your experience when your first child was born, or when your daughter was born?
Yeah, so I have two children. My son was born first, and my children were the family that I never had, you know, because the family that I grew up in, as I said, there was complete neglect. I was never hugged, never touched, never included, used as a scapegoat. I was bashed, I was whipped, you know, my parents tried to kill me numerous times. So that was the family environment I grew up in. And I think, you know, as I understand it, my parents were both what we call Manchurian candidates. You know, again, they were mind controlled by the CIA. Sometimes I feel like my family was and still is an experiment to them, in, you know, trying to learn, you know, more, you know, of how to fracture and destroy people. So when, you know, I always wanted children. I remember at the age of 14 standing in a playground and looking at all the kids playing and laughing and running around and going up and down the slides. And in that moment, I decided I wanted a family because I could see that was something I'd never had and I wanted to be part of. And so, yeah, I ended up getting married and, you know, had two wonderful children. But it was when my daughter was born. Up until that point, I hadn't remembered any of the cult memories or the cult ceremonies. And so when she was born, I had just an overwhelming sense of death. And it wasn't to do with her at all, it was to do with me. And so what happened, and this is typical of what happens for a lot of men, is a lot of our memories are triggered when our children are born, and that was the case for me. For women, it often happens when the children leave home because they feel they can then, you know, focus on their own needs and, you know, rather than their children, you know, it's the maternal instinct. But for men, often it is when your own children are born. And so when Ellie was born, excuse me, when she was born, you know, I had these overwhelming senses of death. Yeah, and I'm looking at this beautiful daughter of mine, and I was so happy she came into the world, and yet I was engulfed, like my whole body felt like it was being dragged into the earth. And then a few nights later, I started getting flashbacks to the ceremony I told you about before when I was 3, and my hand was held on the knife by my father and his mate, who were giggling and laughing as this, you know, little girl was sacrificed. And so that was incredibly difficult with those memories coming back. And not long after that, I went to a meeting of survivors of child abuse, and a woman came up to me and talked to me about disassociation, which I'd never heard of before. And up until that point, I didn't realize I was dissociative. And, you know, disassociation is when we fracture our personality to put the memories in one part so we can, you know, live a relatively normal life without the memories, you know, coming in our face all the time. And when she told me about disassociation, I freaked out. I ran from the room, ran to the toilets, almost passed out, almost threw up, almost peed myself and, pooed my pants and everything. I was shaking uncontrollably and shivering and sweating at the same time. And what she'd done is she'd started connecting the dissociative parts, which the cults had tried so hard to fracture me so much that they never would be reconnected, because the cults know if we reconnect the parts and we remember, that puts them at risk. So that's the whole mechanism there. And the next 3 to 6 months I felt like I'd gone insane, so I had to throw myself into work to try and not focus on it, because I was so vulnerable and so fragile at that point. And then after about 3 months I found a really good psychologist who was experienced in disassociation, and for the next 10 years I worked with him on and off, which was brilliant, to come to terms with the memories, how to deal with the memories, how to process them, how to work through them. And that was an incredible period where I absolutely love the psychology of working with my own psyche and working, understanding what was going in, and I found that incredibly fascinating.
Well, and also you excelled in school, you excelled in university, you're highly intelligent, you have a great career, so you definitely not someone who is hiding behind the trauma. You're confronting, you're facing it, and you're healing. So can we a little bit maybe proceed for the healing path? Because from the people who are watching us, again, the question will be how come he's so normal telling these horrible stories?
How come he appears so normal?
But so can you please elaborate a little bit what is behind this normality quote we see on the screen, and what is the daily life of survivor of satanic ritual abuse?
Well, a lot of people may look at me as normal, but a lot of people don't see the struggles I have. So, often when you die and come back, it elevates your IQ, and my IQ was off the charts. And even I came from a very poor family and went to school in a very poor area. It was easy for me to excel if I was motivated. So the trick for me was motivation, and I love my creativity. I love my art. At the age of 12, I decided I was going to be an architect, and I set my path on that from the age of 12 and didn't waver. And so I chose all my subjects at school, and I excelled at everything that related to that. There were periods where I struggled. Puberty was very difficult for me, because I felt by becoming an adult and my body changing into that of an adult that I was becoming an abuser, because the adults in my family were abusers. And so for 9 months I couldn't talk. I was so anxious and uptight. Most of my childhood I was so anxious it was difficult to eat, and so the level of my trauma, I knew that if I didn't deal with it, I would die. So it wasn't like, well, I can just put it all to the side, because I thought if I do that, I might as well just say goodbye, because it was so intense. It was a life and death level of trauma. Also, as a child, I was drugged repeatedly, which I absolutely hated. And so turning to things like drugs was not an option. Hypnosis was not an option, because I'd been hypnotized as a child. So the things they'd done to me when I was little, mostly up until about the age of 12, though a lot of physical abuse continued after the age of 12, caused an utter revulsion in me in my adult years. So drugs weren't an option. I could not take anything that affected my mind. I had to be in control of my mind, which had its good things and had its bad things. I became a bit of a control freak. So it was finding something that brought me joy. So, my creativity and my career brought me joy. I had a lot of social anxiety. I was very good one-on-one with other people, but not in groups, because groups were too much like the cults. And these were subliminal things. I didn't realize at the time why. And because of the programming, I couldn't question different things. And so it was creativity. I had some wonderful teachers at school who would see me turn up at school covered in bruises or cuts or different things like that, stitches. But, back in that period, people minded their own business. There were no social services or support services. So, no one said anything, And so these teachers would take me under the wing, even for a day. But that meant the world to me, because I didn't have any of that at home. And I always had lots of lovely friends, people who were really lovely to me. But, out of this horrific childhood, I used to, want to be honest and kind and always do the nice thing to other people, because that's what gave me hope. And so I just built on that. There were periods where, I'd go well, and then, up and down. And there were periods where the trauma in my body would be so intense I couldn't get out of bed, and sometimes I just have to force myself. When I was in my early 20s and I'd moved in with my older brother, and we were getting on quite well at that stage, which was very healing, and then they killed him, and I had to go to the morgue and identify his body, so I got shattered all over again. And then the doctors tried to put me on medication, and I took it for 3 days, and it turned me into a zombie. And I just thought, I'm not going to be able to finish my degree, and that was so important to me that I achieved that. And so I went back to the doctor and I said, my brother is dead. It's meant to hurt. And so I went into the pain. I felt the pain, because for me, the fact that it hurt so much showed me how much I loved him. And so that was more important, was that, and throughout life it's been difficult. I've managed to achieve things that were really important to me, but I've crashed and burned lots of times. I've got very good at picking myself up off the ground.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate. I would like to proceed to the topic, which is a bit controversial for our civilized and educated society, which is spirituality.
Yeah.
Which I know that you're one of the strongest side and part. And can you please tell our audience who helped you on this path, and the support you always had, have, and will have?
Yeah, well, it was going out of body was the safe place to go for most of us who've been through this. And often they will use ceremonies where, for example, being raped as a young child at the age of 3, they believe that they use a young male child to access the spiritual realms and to call in spirits to do their bidding for them. And I mean,
demonic spirits, excuse me, I suppose.
Sorry?
Demonic spirits.
Well,
how would you?
To me, I call them entities.
Entities.
I think we put the layers on spirits that we choose. I believe that the deceivers are the most deceived. So the deceivers are creating something, and I think the entities play along with it, But my experience with spirits, I don't fear spirits at all, and I talk to them. And they've always been very loving and kind to me, and it's been an interesting journey. But so there's layers to it. But probably about, again, around the ages of 10 to 12, I think it was, I found an old Bible in a cupboard and I started reading it. And the covers were torn off and it smelt musty and was in thee, thy, they, and all that. But I started reading it. And so I read it cover to cover 3 times. I think
you were 10.
Yeah, by the time I was about 16, I'd read it cover to cover. And I developed this incredible relationship with God one-on-one, because I didn't know what a Christian was. My parents, we didn't go to church. We didn't have visitors in the home. We were very isolated. I remember going past the church at age 5, and I always had precognition. I could always tell the future to a point. And I remember walking past the church at the age of 5 on the way to school, I think it was, and I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to have that's going to be part of my future. I just knew it at the age of 5. But at that age, all a church meant to me was fates, because that's all I'd seen, is that's where people have fates and you go and buy things. So I just assumed that I'd be going to fates in the future. But I developed a very, very powerful spirituality, and I realized that God really, really loved me, really intensely loved me. And that's what carried me through. And I mean, I hated and despised my parents as a child. And I remember divorcing my parents spiritually and saying, God, well, you're my true father, not these people, you know. And that's sort of what sustained me and got me through, because it's with the level of trauma and the programming, you also have a suicide program. You know, so most of my childhood I was suicidal. And I just had
Can you please a little bit, excuse me for interruption, explain what is suicide programming for our
suicide
audience?
Programming is when you are programmed by the cults that if you ever start remembering or waking up, you have to kill yourself. So it's like part of your dissociative state goes over and over, kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself. But I was able to realize that that wasn't
you.
It was part of me, if I can say that. But it was a part of me that was programmed to say that, and that part of me didn't want to say that, if I can say it. So it became an annoying noise, in the back of my head eventually. But when you're a child and dealing with it, and, so I've got the spiritual side saying, we love you and we care for you. And then you got this program going, harm, 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 harm. So the spiritual side won over. And anyway, in high school, we had some people come to church who were Christian, and, there was a revival and, things like that. And then I eventually went to church, and I was horrified because it wasn't what I thought it was. So anyway, I got to uni and got involved in Christianity. Then I was going to become a missionary. I got married, went to Bible college. I was doing another degree in intercultural studies. We're going to, go to Africa and, all sorts of things. And then, the marriage imploded because I was doing a lot of work on myself, and my wife had her own childhood issues, but for her it was too painful. So,
separated.
Yeah, I changed and she didn't. And, so I ended the relationship. So I forgot where we were going with the question.
Well, the stronger spiritual side, who helped you on the way. So you mentioned in our private conversation your spirit guides, and that you feel very protected from the very young age.
So when I went through the divorce, the church became and I'd been a lay pastor at the church, so they became very antagonistic towards me. So then I had to take my ex-wife and the church to court, and I got a whole pile of court orders against them to protect my children. And it was interesting, while this was going on, I felt utterly loved by God while the church was throwing, shooting at me. And it was, you can look back and laugh about it. At the time, it wasn't fun. It was, because I lost everything. My kids got hidden, all my friends walked away from me. I lost my business and so on and so on. But again, Spirit never abandoned me. I became very disenfranchised with organised religion. But it's, my spirit keeps growing stronger and stronger. And in recent years, I did a bit of work with psychedelics, which even strengthened it even more. But one of the things that's carried me through is this very strong knowledge that I'm loved, above and beyond everything. And so currently I see this world as a simulation, that we come in to learn things, and we come here to grow as souls, and then, we return to source. And so from my perspective, and it's just my belief, I see the perceptions of religions is within the container of this incarnation. And when we die, we go above that back to source. So I don't fear so-called demons or things like that. And I feel in the spiritual realms, often I'm told what's going to happen ahead of time, the things that I need to know. And for me, there's a lot of trust there. I'm often guided in things that I may not understand at the time, but when I allow them to happen, they usually end up in huge blessing.
Beautifully. And to sum up a little bit, for We hope that someday, and maybe already now, we will have more male survivors who are speaking out. And if they are watching our interview right now, what would be your message to survivors in general, to population in general, and especially to male survivors, because we just don't see him? You're basically one of the very few who are speaking out and who have so much knowledge, because apart from everything you have shared with us so generously, you are also a great researcher, and we will give a link on your website and all your other testimonies. So what would you say?
I would say to survivors, it's worth it to heal. You know, it's, for me, the blessing that has come from facing my fears, from dealing with my pain, has been immense. You know, I can now relate to other human beings without anxiety, without fear. Pain hurts, you know, and I've known pain unlike most people, you know, but when you face it and you go through it, you get stronger. You know, as I said, I've scraped myself up off the floor. You know, so many times I've become an expert at it, but you eventually realize you're not a victim, you're a warrior, you know, and when you realize that and you realize how strong you are and how strong you become, but it's as you heal, you appreciate things a lot more. And I think when you've been through trauma, you appreciate things a lot more. You know, you don't take things for granted. You know, I can sit here and, you know, look at a beautiful flower, and it's just the beauty in that. You know, I don't need a lot to be happy, you know, and it...
But still, you say you don't need a lot to be happy, and definitely I agree with you. And with all of that, I just see you as a very happy person.
I am. I have a lot of self-love now, you know. One of the most important things I learned was to stop criticizing myself, stop getting angry at myself, and to respond to myself with love and understanding. So when I'm feeling upset, I sit down and go, what's going on? What's below this? What can I do to help myself? You know, and as I did that and learned how to become very, very good at that, you know, all of a sudden I stopped getting in my own way and making my life more difficult. So, you know, it's the immense joy in healing, and you know, it only needs to take a little step by little step by little step at you know, the pace that, you know, people, particularly men, are comfortable with. But a little bit of courage and another little bit and another little bit, and soon you become very good at courage. You know, and so it's just, but for me, to be able to experience such horrors, but also to experience such joy in the same lifetime has been incredible.
Thank you so much, Doug. Again, I would like to say that it's the greatest honor not only to have you here, to know you, and it's my biggest blessing to have you as a friend as well.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Holger. And I hope what we've talked about is a blessing to many people.
Yes, it is, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you.